The cabin lights cast a soft glow over the passengers as they settled into their seats, the hum of the engines providing a steady background noise. It was a full flight from New York to Los Angeles, and Brian Mitchell had worked this route countless times. After 22 years as a flight attendant, he knew every type of traveler: the anxious ones who needed reassurance, the entitled ones who demanded perfection, and the quiet ones who just wanted to get through the journey undisturbed. Alicia Carter, 22 years old, poised and confident, took her seat in 14A. She had boarded the plane with her usual grace, a law student at Harvard returning home after an academic conference. Dressed in a fitted navy blazer and dark jeans, she had an air of quiet authority, someone who knew exactly who she was. Brian noticed her immediately. Not because she was another passenger to tend to, but because he recognized her. It took a moment, but then the memory surfaced: the restaurant. The night everything changed. It had been years ago. Brian had been working as a floor manager at an upscale steakhouse when a black family had walked in, well-dressed, well-spoken, and, in his mind, far too demanding. He hadn't treated them badly, at least, not in his own estimation, but something had happened. A complaint was filed, and suddenly, his job was gone. And now, here she was. The girl who had been at the center of it all, sitting in his cabin, expecting his service. He tightened his jaw and looked away. It started subtly. "Excuse me," Alicia said, raising a hand as Brian walked past. He barely glanced at her. "One moment," he muttered, without slowing his stride. Minutes passed. Brian attended to another passenger, an older white woman who requested a pillow. He smiled, nodded, and fetched it immediately. Alicia watched the interaction, her brows knitting together. When he finally returned, his tone was clipped. "Yes." She offered a polite smile. "Could I get a bottle of water, please?" Brian exhaled sharply, as if she had asked for a 5-course meal. "We'll begin beverage service soon," he said, already turning away. Alicia blinked. "I just need some water, that's all. I said we'll begin beverage service soon." His voice was sharper now, impatient. A few passengers turned their heads. Alicia sat back, pressing her lips together. She wasn't imagining it. Still, she let it go for now. An hour into the flight, the tension escalated. Alicia pressed her call button. Brian saw it, ignored it, walked past her row twice. The third time, she spoke up. "Excuse me, sir." Brian stopped and looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "I asked for water a while ago," Alicia said, keeping her voice level. Brian's smile was tight. "And I told you that beverage service was coming." She took a slow breath. "Yes. But you brought a drink for 12B 5 minutes ago." Brian folded his arms. "We have an order of service, ma'am. You're not the only passenger on this plane." Alicia stared at him. There was something in his tone, in the way his lips curled slightly as he said, "Ma'am," that made her stomach turn. It wasn't about the water. It was something else. A man sitting across the aisle glanced between them. The woman in 13C shifted uncomfortably. The tension was now visible. Alicia straightened her shoulders. "I don't believe I asked for special treatment. Just the same courtesy you've shown to others." Brian let out a short laugh, the kind meant to humiliate. "Courtesy?" His voice dropped. "You people always think someone owes you something." The words sliced through the air. A hush spread across the rows nearby. Alicia's chest tightened. A woman 2 seats ahead turned around. "Excuse me, what did you just say?" Brian's expression faltered for half a second, but he quickly recovered. "I meant entitled passengers. Some people act like they're the only ones who matter." Alicia's fingers curled into fists on her lap. The woman in 13C pulled out her phone and hit record. "Say that again," she challenged. Brian's eyes darted to the phone. His jaw clenched. "I don't have time for this," he muttered, stepping away. But the damage was done. Minutes later, the head flight attendant, Laura Simmons, approached. "I was told there was an issue here," she said, her voice even. Alicia looked at Brian, then back at Laura. "I asked for water. He ignored me. I asked again. He mocked me." Laura's gaze flicked to Brian. "Is that true?" Brian scoffed. "Oh, come on. I'm just doing my job. Some passengers are a little sensitive." Alicia's nostrils flared. "This isn't sensitivity. It's disrespect." Laura hesitated. She had worked with Brian for years. He was usually professional, but she had also heard rumors. Passengers were now watching intently. Phones were out. Recording. Laura turned to Brian. "Apologize." Brian crossed his arms. "For what?" "Not moving fast enough for her." Alicia let out a slow breath. "I see." She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood. "I need the pilot," she said. Brian chuckled. "The pilot? You think the captain is going to care about your little tantrum?" A deep, steady voice cut through the air. "He will." Brian turned. A man in an expensive suit was walking toward them from first class. Charles Carter, Alicia's father. The color drained from Brian's face. Charles reached his daughter's side and placed a hand on her shoulder. He looked at her first, his dark eyes scanning her face as if making sure she was okay. Then he turned to Brian, his expression unreadable. "You know who she is?" Charles asked, his voice quiet but firm. Brian opened his mouth, but no words came out. Charles didn't blink. "She's my daughter," he said. A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Brian's throat tightened. Charles turned to Laura. "I need to speak with the captain." Laura nodded immediately and reached for her intercom. Brian stood frozen, a sinking feeling crawling through his chest. Alicia, still standing, met Brian's gaze one last time. This time, he was the one who looked away. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. Every passenger nearby had turned their attention to the unfolding scene, their eyes darting between Alicia, her father, and Brian. Brian's face burned. His heart pounded against his ribcage as he tried to process the situation. Charles Carter. That Charles Carter. A billionaire, a board member of multiple corporations, including, as Brian suddenly remembered with horror, Skyways Airlines. Laura, the head flight attendant, hesitated only for a moment before reaching for the intercom. "Captain, we have an issue in the main cabin. Mr. Carter has requested to speak with you." A crackle, then the captain's voice. "Understood. I'll be there shortly." Brian swallowed. This was spiraling out of control faster than he could manage. Alicia sat down, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed the fabric of her jeans. She wasn't someone who sought conflict, but she also wasn't someone who let things slide. Her father had taught her that. Charles remained standing, his broad frame casting a shadow over Brian. "You've worked for this airline a long time, haven't you?" Charles asked, his voice still eerily calm. Brian forced a stiff nod. "Yes, sir." "And yet, you thought it was acceptable to treat my daughter with blatant disrespect." Brian stopped himself. "Choose your words carefully." He knew better than to escalate things now. "I was just following protocol," Brian finally said. There was no need for her to make a scene. A soft gasp came from someone behind him. Alicia let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "I made a scene." Charles's jaw tightened. "So, let me get this straight. A young woman politely requests water. You ignore her. She asks again. You mock her. And now, you're trying to shift the blame onto her." Brian felt the weight of a dozen stares pressing down on him. He clenched his fists at his sides. "I didn't mean any harm," he muttered, though the words felt weak even to his own ears. "Didn't mean any harm?" Alicia repeated. "Tell me, do you treat all your passengers this way, or just the black ones?" A murmur spread through the rows. The woman in 13C, still recording, zoomed in on Brian's face. I don't see color," Brian blurted out. It was a knee-jerk response, a line he had heard people use before. Charles let out a slow, controlled breath. You don't see color." He let the words hang between them. "But somehow, the only person you had a problem serving today just so happened to be a black woman." Brian opened his mouth, then shut it again. "Dad," Alicia said softly, "it's fine." "No," Charles replied, his voice still calm but firm. "It's not fine." The captain arrived moments later, his uniform crisp, his expression carefully neutral. "What's going on here?" Laura stepped forward first. "There was an incident regarding passenger treatment. Mr. Carter has raised a concern about inappropriate behavior from a crew member." The captain's gaze shifted to Charles, then Alicia, then Brian. Charles extended his hand. "Captain, my name is Charles Carter. I believe you recognize my name." The captain hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir, I do. I assume you understand how serious this is." The captain cleared his throat. "Of course." He turned to Brian. "What happened?" Brian hesitated. How could he explain it without making himself look worse? "I may have been a little short with the passenger," he admitted. Alicia's eyebrows shot up. "Short?" Brian ignored her and continued, "But I didn't mean anything by it. It was busy, and I was trying to get through service." The captain's gaze was unreadable. "Is there a video?" The woman in 13C raised her phone. "There sure is." Brian felt the last bit of control slip from his grasp. The captain took the phone, watched for a few seconds, then exhaled. "Brian, I need you to step into the galley." Brian stiffened. "Captain." "No." He had no choice but to comply. He turned sharply, walking toward the galley, feeling every eye on him as he went. In the galley, the captain crossed his arms. "Brian, I've worked with you for years. But this is unacceptable." Brian's chest tightened. "Sir, I wasn't trying to be disrespectful." The captain narrowed his eyes. "Then what were you trying to be? Because from where I stand, it looks a lot like racial bias." Brian felt his stomach drop. "Do you know who Charles Carter is?" the captain continued. Brian nodded. "Yes, sir." "Then you also know that this could turn into a PR nightmare for the airline. We don't tolerate this kind of behavior, and we certainly don't ignore it when it involves someone with Carter's level of influence." Brian clenched his jaw. "So what happens now?" The captain studied him for a long moment. "We land in Los Angeles in 3 hours. When we do, you'll be escorted off the aircraft and taken to a debrief with HR and senior management. They'll decide whether you still have a job after this." Brian's throat tightened. "Sir, please." The captain held up a hand. "I can't help you, Brian. You did this to yourself." The words hit like a slap. Back in the cabin, Alicia leaned against the window, trying to steady her breath. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her exhausted. Her father sat beside her now, his presence grounding. "You okay?" Charles asked softly. She nodded. "Yeah." A pause. I hate that this still happens." Charles sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know." She turned to look at him. "If you hadn't been here, he would have gotten away with it." Charles met her gaze. "That's why we can't stay silent." Alicia exhaled. "I know." The woman in 13C leaned over. "I just want to say, that was really brave of you." Alicia offered a small smile. "Thank you." Another passenger, a middle-aged man, chimed in. "What he did was disgusting. I hope he gets fired." More murmurs of agreement followed. Alicia wasn't sure how she felt. Satisfaction? No, not quite. It was deeper than that. It wasn't about Brian losing his job. It was about the principle. About dignity. The flight continued, but the air felt different now. People were talking about race, about fairness, about how things needed to change. Brian, sitting in the galley alone, could hear every word. And for the first time, he realized there was no escaping this. Brian sat in the galley, his head in his hands. The once familiar hum of the engines now felt suffocating. His uniform, which had always been a symbol of authority, suddenly felt like a costume he no longer deserved to wear. The whispers from the cabin weren't whispers anymore. They were full-blown conversations, spoken just loud enough for him to hear. "I hope they fire him. People like that shouldn't be in customer service. Imagine how many times he's done this before and gotten away with it." Each sentence hit like a punch to the gut. The worst part? He knew they weren't wrong. Meanwhile, in row 14A, Alicia was still trying to process everything. She had experienced microaggressions before. The professor who seemed shocked that she was the top student in her class. The security guard who had followed her in a high-end store when she was just looking at purses. The subtle but clear hesitation in a waiter's voice when she walked into a restaurant alone, as if she didn't belong there. But this had been different. It hadn't been subtle. It had been blatant. It had been humiliating. And it had happened in front of dozens of witnesses. She glanced at her father. Charles Carter was known for his power, his control. But right now, his jaw was clenched, his fingers tapping against the armrest, a telltale sign that he was furious. She nudged him gently. "Dad, I can handle this." He turned to her, his dark eyes unreadable. "I know you can. That's not the point." "Then what is?" Charles exhaled, glancing toward the front of the cabin where the captain had taken Brian aside. "The point is that people like him only change when they're forced to face the consequences of their actions." Alicia sighed. "You really think he'll change?" A bitter smile tugged at the corner of Charles's lips. "That's not up to me. That's up to him." 2 hours later, the plane began its descent. The tension in the cabin hadn't faded. If anything, it had only grown stronger. Laura, the head flight attendant, had informed Alicia that a full report had already been sent to corporate. The airline's PR team was likely scrambling to figure out how to handle this before the story went viral. Too late. The woman in 13C had already uploaded the video. Within minutes, it had thousands of views. The comment section was brutal. He thought he could get away with it. Not today. How many times has this guy treated black passengers like this before? Skyways Airlines, do something. No. Alicia wasn't sure how to feel. Part of her was relieved that people were taking it seriously. But another part of her felt tired. Tired of always having to prove that she deserved basic respect. As soon as the plane touched down in Los Angeles, an announcement came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that all passengers remain seated as we escort a crew member off the aircraft." A hush fell over the cabin. Alicia turned her head just in time to see 2 airline officials board the plane, their expressions unreadable. "Brian Mitchell?" one of them asked. Brian swallowed hard, stood up slowly, and adjusted his uniform. Every step toward the exit felt like walking toward a firing squad. As he passed Alicia's row, he hesitated. Alicia met his gaze, her expression calm but unwavering. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no words. Charles, however, did. "I hope you remember this moment, Mr. Mitchell," he said, his voice cold. "Because I promise you, we will." Brian lowered his eyes and kept walking. The doors opened. The world outside was waiting. Brian stepped off the plane into the jet bridge, flanked by 2 airline officials. The air felt heavy, suffocating. He had spent over 2 decades working flights just like this one, walking through these same corridors with his head held high. But now, each step felt like a march toward the inevitable. Alicia Carter had power. More power than he had realized. And he had underestimated just how quickly that power could turn his world upside down. He could already hear his phone vibrating non-stop in his pocket. Messages, calls, alerts from people who had probably seen the video. How bad is it? He wondered. As he entered the terminal, he caught sight of a TV screen near the gates. His stomach dropped. There it was. His face. Breaking news. Flight attendant accused of discrimination against Harvard law student. Incident caught on video. A shaky clip played on the screen, showing his sarcastic smirk, Alicia's calm but firm voice, and worst of all, the moment Charles Carter stood up and revealed who he was. The headline alone was enough to make his knees weak. People in the terminal whispered. Some looked at him with recognition. A few pulled out their phones. They know. His entire life was about to change. Alicia and Charles stepped off the plane minutes later, walking past the crowd of passengers who had witnessed everything. Some of them nodded at her, silently showing support. Others offered words of encouragement. "You handled that with such grace," an older woman murmured. "Thank you," Alicia said, offering a small, grateful smile. But inside, she was still processing. The weight of it all sat heavy in her chest. As they walked toward baggage claim, Charles finally broke the silence. I have a meeting with the airline's executives in an hour." His voice was controlled, but Alicia could hear the restrained fury beneath it. Alicia exhaled. "Dad, you don't have to." "I do." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "This isn't just about you. It's about all the people he's treated like this before. People who didn't have the power to fight back." Alicia swallowed. She knew he was right. "Do you want to be there?" he asked. She hesitated. She had spent years preparing to be a lawyer, to fight battles exactly like this. But at that moment, she wasn't sure if she had the energy to sit in a room full of corporate executives trying to minimize the damage. "I trust you," she finally said. "Handle it." Charles nodded. "I will." Brian sat in the airline's corporate office, his fingers gripping the arms of the chair. The HR director, the head of flight operations, and a legal representative sat across from him. The HR director, a woman with sharp eyes and a firm voice, cleared her throat. "Brian, let's get straight to it. The video of your interaction with Ms. Carter has gone viral. We've received thousands of complaints in the last hour alone. Sponsors are asking questions. The board wants answers." Brian swallowed. I didn't mean for it to escalate like that." The head of flight operations leaned forward. "Escalate?" He scoffed. "You humiliated a passenger. A black passenger. A Harvard law student. And you did it in front of her father, one of the most powerful businessmen in the country." Brian felt his stomach churn. "I wasn't thinking about any of that." "No, you weren't," the HR director snapped. "And now we have a PR nightmare." Brian gripped the arms of his chair tighter. "Are you firing me?" The room was silent. The HR director glanced at the legal representative, who sighed and folded his hands on the table. "Brian, we're placing you on immediate unpaid leave while we investigate. But let's be real, once the board reviews this, there won't be much to investigate." Brian's head spun. This can't be happening. He had spent decades in this career. He had given everything to it. And now, a few minutes of arrogance, of unchecked resentment, had shattered it all. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. The HR director glanced up. "Come in." The door opened, and Charles Carter stepped inside. Brian felt the blood drain from his face. Brian stiffened in his chair as Charles Carter stepped inside the corporate office. The room, already tense, fell into absolute silence. The HR director cleared her throat. "Mr. Carter, Charles raised a hand, silencing her. His gaze locked onto Brian, unreadable. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Charles exhaled slowly and sat across from Brian. "Let's talk." Alicia sat in the back seat of her father's car, scrolling through her phone. The video had exploded online. News outlets were picking it up. Journalists were reaching out. A wave of support flooded her notifications, but mixed in with the usual comments, the ones calling her dramatic, attention-seeking, playing the race card. She sighed. Would it always be like this? Would every time she stood up for herself turn into a debate about whether or not she deserved respect? The driver pulled up to her father's office building. Alicia hesitated, then made a decision. She wasn't done yet. Back in the boardroom, Brian sat frozen as Charles studied him. "I read about you," Charles said finally. 22 years in the airline industry. No major complaints. A few questionable interactions, but nothing that got escalated. Brian swallowed hard. Charles leaned forward. "So tell me, what made you look at my daughter and decide she was beneath you?" Brian opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't have a good answer. He could say he'd been having a bad day. He could say he was stressed, overwhelmed. But none of that would excuse what he did. And they both knew it. He hesitated. "I knew who she was." Charles's eyes narrowed. Brian's fingers curled into fists. "Not at first. But when I recognized her, I remembered. Years ago. I worked at a restaurant. She and her family came in. And after that night, I lost my job." Charles didn't react. "Go on." Brian let out a bitter chuckle. "I told myself it wasn't about race. That it was just about her. But maybe he exhaled, shaking his head. Maybe I wanted to make her feel as small as I felt that night. The truth. Ugly and exposed. Charles nodded slowly. And did it work? Brian looked down at the table. No. A knock on the door interrupted them. Alicia stepped inside. Brian tensed. She looked at her father, then at Brian, arms crossed. I want to say something. Charles gestured for her to continue. Alicia's voice was steady. What you did to me on that flight was humiliating. But it wasn't just about me. It was about every person you've looked down on. Every passenger you've treated differently because you thought they couldn't do anything about it. Brian clenched his jaw. I don't need an apology, Alicia continued. Because an apology doesn't change anything. What I want is for you to understand what you did. Not just to me. To yourself. Brian met her gaze. You let your bitterness turn into hate, she said softly. And now look where it got you. The words stung more than anything else. Charles stood. The airline will handle your employment status. But Brian, I suggest you figure out who you want to be after this. Because the man you are right now, he shook his head. He won't survive in the world we're living in. Brian swallowed hard. He had nothing left to say. Alicia turned to leave. Just before she stepped out, Brian finally spoke. I was wrong. She paused, then nodded. I know. And with that, she walked away. 3 weeks later, Brian sat at home, staring at the official termination letter from Skyways Airlines. The investigation had been quick. The airline, desperate to save face, had cut ties with him immediately. His career was over. For days, he had been angry. At Alicia, at Charles, at the airline, at the world. But now, sitting alone, he realized something. No one had done this to him. He had. The bitterness, the resentment, it had consumed him. And in the end, it had cost him everything. He reached for his phone, opened his browser, and typed something he never thought he'd search for. How to unlearn racial bias. Maybe it was too late. Or maybe it wasn't. Across the city, Alicia sat in a coffee shop, reading an article about the airline's new diversity and inclusion initiative. The public backlash had forced them to make changes. Policies were being rewritten. Training was being implemented. It wasn't enough. But it was a start. Her father sat across from her, watching her closely. You proud of yourself? He asked. She took a sip of her coffee and smiled. Yeah, I am. And for the first time in weeks, she felt lighter. Because this hadn't just been about a flight. It had been about something bigger. And she had won.